Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to Whimsical and Interesting Musings, bringing you whimsical and interesting musings every day all year round. And today I have a book review for you today. So we're going to actually be doing a book review on the novel Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, and this book is quite simply a masterpiece of slice of life romance, character driven storytelling. And Haruki Murakami is a very interesting novelist. This was the novel that actually skyrocketed him to a literary phenomenon back when it was first written in 1988, I want to say. Yes, or 1987, I think it was. Yeah, 1987. He wrote this in the 80s, the mid 80s, and he pretty much has been writing all sorts of different books before that point. He was writing books about, um, mostly focused on surrealism, but trying to use surrealism as a means of telling a story or getting inside a character's psychology, psyche, and trying to figure out who they are. So a good majority of his books use surrealism and the supernatural as a way of kind of unlocking a character's inner turmoil, inner struggles. And a good majority of the time, Haruki Murakami writes about teenagers. And he writes about teenagers not in a very glamorized kind of way. He writes about teenagers as they are, which is that they're very vulnerable. They're very kind of in a place where they're kind of between. They're not quite old enough to be considered adults, but then they're not quite young enough to be considered children. And so they're kind of like in this in between where they're still kind of taking orders from authority and having to respect authority, the authority of teachers, but then they're also not old enough to kind of have the responsibility of adulthood, like, having a mortgage, getting a job, and all these other things. So it is a very interesting time between to sort of focus on characters. But the way Haruki Murakami does it, he honestly does it. He could write a story about the struggles of childhood in his sort of struggles of being a teenager in his sleep. He could literally do that because he literally does a very good job of kind of highlighting how difficult it was at that stage to be a teenager, because you're going through all sorts of different changes. Your body's changing, your voice is changing, the way you look at your body, so you're thinking to yourself, oh my god, what's happening to me? All these weird things are happening. I'm starting to feel weird, attractions to other people and things like that. And I'm starting to, do all sorts of other things that I might not be able to mention. But yes, it's one of those things that really does add a certain level of anxiety and stress. But this book is actually quite special. It follows the main character of Toru Watanabe, and he is a man who, when we first meet him, he's in his 30s, and he's just returning to a flight he's just about to arrive in Finland in a early flight. And as people are getting off the plane, as seatbelts are being, taken off, and people starting to evacuate the plane in an orderly fashion, an instrumental version of John Lennon's Norwegian Wood comes on in the overhead speakers. Because if you've ever been on a plane, you do often get these interludes where when you either board, when you're just boarding a plane, or when you're just leaving a plane, they always play music sometimes, and sometimes they'll play very topical, kind of very popular music, like I don't know, Clean Bandit's Rather Be, or Florence and the Machine's Stand By Me, rendition of Stand By Me. There's so many particular artists that they play. Sometimes they'll play instrumental versions of songs that like Lord's Royal or something like that, and they often do that a lot in planes. But this particular version really strikes a chord with Watanabe, because he ends up remembering a childhood friend by the name of Naoko. And she is a very interesting character because it's a story about their connection. And their connection to each other is kind of linked by a singular being, which is a man who is called Kizuki. And he is a man who, when we don't actually hear his point of view, we don't actually see him as a character fully come to life. We just hear about what other people are saying about him and what he kind of does to sort of, influence all these people's lives. It's kind of like, he's kind of like, if I were to kind of give it a bit of a push, he's kind of like George Bailey in the sense that he has kind of like this very kind of almost ethereal feel to him, where when people talk about him and all the great things he's done, people are kind of, very amazed at how, great this character is, and how, nice and friendly and how caring and considerate he can be. And it kind of makes you feel like, oh, or better yet, the better example I think is is the character of Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, who is a character who, when we hear about her, she's been murdered, and everyone's upset. Everyone is absolutely devastated that this poor girl has just been murdered horribly. And at first you're wondering why, because she did all these wonderful things. She helped out so many people. She did a lot for, her community. She really loved a lot of people, gave a lot of love and a lot of care and a lot of light into a lot of people's dark worlds. But when she's murdered, a lot of people are devastated and want to know why. And that was the hook of Twin Peaks. But here, Kazuki is kind of is kind of like that version where people are so happy to see him. He's a grade A student. He passed with flying colours. He's very handsome, and he manages to hang out with these two misfits, Naoko and Watanabe. And then all of a sudden he commits suicide, and people are wondering, why did he do this? Why did he, um, do this horrible thing to himself when he seemed so happy? He seemed like he was on cloud nine. Like he's got the girl Naoko, he's got the best friend Watanabe, he's got his grade A student, he's very popular, he's very good looking. So why would he kill himself? And that really is where the real heart of the story is. But not so much what happened to him and what made him do the things that he did. It's more about how his relationship kind of affects the people around him, particularly these two characters, Watanabe and Naoko. And this story is pretty triggering, especially if you've been going through grief or any kind of mental issues like depression or anxiety or anything like that. It's a very kind of hard hitting book. So I would recommend that if you are easily triggered, or you feel like this book is too real for you at times, I would recommend giving this book a skip. But if you can handle the very kind of difficult subject matter, the very tough subject matter of discussing mental health, especially things like depression and what have you, I would recommend reading on, because Haruki Murakami is one of the best at writing these very eloquent prose. And I'll try and find examples in this particular book. But what basically the story is, it's about these two characters, Naoko and Watanabe, who are basically trying to grieve after they have lost their best friend to a very horrible thing called suicide. And they start to connect. And at first you think, oh, it's going to be like this very kind of lovey-dovey romance, and it's really going to be like, it's going to be this very kind of heartfelt story, but it's kind of going to have this very kind of darker edge to it, with the best friend having committed suicide. But what's very interesting is the book kind of discusses the very toxic elements of that, and kind of says to people, look, just because you guys are both attracted to each other and you both have this kind of connection, that you're both, best friends with this guy, or connected by this one guy who sadly passed away, does not mean you should go and pursue a relationship. And there's several scenes throughout where it literally is showing all kinds of red flags. Excuse me, all these kinds of red flags about why this thing shouldn't be happening. So when it gets to the point where there's actually a scene where it's Naoko's birthday, it's her 21st birthday, I believe, and she's just talking to Watanabe, and he literally is talking about the way her lips move, and the way she the way the sort of airiness in her voice and the casualness in which she's speaking these words, and it doesn't seem real. It seems very kind of it seems very kind of almost imaginary, almost like he's experiencing a dream. It's very kind of slowed down and very kind of meditative, and almost like a melted watch feeling, like a very surreal image of the melted watch by Salvador Dali kind of thing. And he then says at one point, like, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Naoko, but I have to leave now. I have to go home. And Naoko just pauses, and she twitches her lip a little bit, and she's like, oh, that's a bit unfair. She doesn't actually say those things, but she does kind of have this little twitch, like this little thing. And then she just continues talking about this thing she's talking to him about. And that really goes to show that she is someone who is severely in the thick of bereavement. She's in the thick of grief. She's in the thick of depression. And she's a character who literally doesn't want to have Watanabe leave, even though technically he has to leave because he has to go home. He's got a life to go to. He's got responsibilities of his own to deal with. So when the final nail in the coffin is when she actually nearly tries to hurt herself, and that's where the real heart of the novel takes place, in the sense that these two characters are trying to connect with each other on a much more mutual and platonic way rather than romantic, because even though they're not romantically involved, there are moments where they do get involved, but it's mostly just for the purpose of sex and lust. There's no real affection or no real romantic love there whatsoever. And Watanabe, this is one of the things that I think is actually quite controversial about the book, because Watanabe clearly loves Naoko, but Naoko is in a very vulnerable state. She's lost the man she loves, and she is constantly, clinging on to whatever she can to keep his memory alive, including Watanabe. But Watanabe is kind of using this as a way of not necessarily manipulating her, but kind of just to get what he wants, which is a cheap thrill. And his cheap thrill is obviously to sleep with her. And that I found completely and utterly, kind of very shady and really kind of awful. But at the same time, what makes this particular moment special is that Murakami knows that what Watanabe is doing is awful. He knows what what Watanabe is doing is absolutely horrendous, and he shouldn't be doing it. But in a way, Watanabe is grieving in his own way over the loss of his friend. He's grieving in his own way about the loss of his character, and he feels that in order to honour his friend's memory, he needs to take care of her. It's just that message of taking care of your friend's partner or your friend's girlfriend or whatever often means to him that he needs to indulge in some of his more darker urges, which is to have her for his own. And that is very problematic. But the idea of essentially taking these characters who are very vulnerable and kind of using it to sort of fulfill your own dark desires is kind of a theme in the Book of Norwegian Wood. And of course, Norwegian Wood is a very kind of hypnotic, very kind of almost spiritual song by John Lennon. If you've actually listened to it, it's actually a really beautiful song. And in many ways, it also has this kind of element of dreariness and this element of sadness, or this element of bleakness, which kind of pairs this wonderful tandem of this very wonderful tandem of both having this happiness, this need for nostalgia, this need for connection with your past, coupled with the bleakness of an uncertain future. And that kind of feeling is peppered throughout the instrumentation of Norwegian Wood, and of course John Lennon's vocals, given that he was quite horribly assassinated at one point, and he had kind of like this legacy of being kind of like this incredible advocate for the hippie movement, and just flower power and all these other things, and just being spiritually in tuned with yourself and being happy. It really is quite an interesting take to have, that he kind of always plays a song that has kind of like this it's both an encapsulation of nostalgia whilst also holding within it this bleakness of an uncertain future, this idea of where are you going to go? You find yourself not moving, you're kind of not in this very positive space. And it was beautifully done in that song, and I think it's beautifully done with Haruki Murakami's interpretation. And a lot of Haruki Murakami novels are named after songs, and a lot of his reasoning for this was he ran a jazz club in Japan before he became a full-time writer, and sometimes while he was writing some of his best books, he was managing this jazz club. And of course, seeing a lot of his novels to become sort of like the inspiration, he was sort of inspired by songs to write these stories, really goes to show what kind of an interesting role or an interesting tool music can play in a lot of our lives, and how often the best songs can take you back to a time where you just feel completely utterly at peace. You feel like you're indulging in this happiness for a time. But then when the song's over, it's like your reality is shattered. It's like for one moment you're living in a dream and you're kind of, you're kind of living some of your best memories. But then once it ends, it kind of just shatters and it goes away. And it's a fantastic idea. And of course, I've always said the best musicians, the best music you will ever hear lets you float away, lets you daydream, and lets you, think about things. And if you're not if you're aware of the fact that you're listening to music and you're listening to the very kind of irritable sounds of some of the instruments or whatever, if you're aware of the music, that's when it doesn't become good music. That's how I can define good music from music that I don't like, pretty much. Because there's no such thing as bad music. It's just what a person can take away from it. Because I may not like certain genres of music compared to other people, but I have, met people. I even had a date with a man who was a DJ. He is a DJ. He still is doing his DJing, but meeting him and getting the chance to actually spend time with him and actually talk about his preference to music, it made me appreciate a genre that I might not have loved before or might not have had a huge respect for. It made me have a huge respect for that genre in itself. And he probably felt the same way about the way he felt with my taste in music. He probably thought, oh, I'm not that keen on it. But when he actually listened to a few songs that I'd actually recommended to him, he actually found, oh, yeah, that's actually pretty good. And I actually like that. I like the fact that we were able to find a connection through music and kind of try to, find that through line, as it were. But that's the thing with music, and that's what's really beautiful about this story, is that they're connected with this one song, which is both encapsulating just the wonder and beauty of nostalgia coupled with this very kind of bleakness. Because when the song just ends suddenly with the string just being plucked, and it just sort of ends on this very dead air silence, it really kind of encapsulates this idea that these characters at the end of it don't know what they want to do. And it's the same with this story, because the book ends in a very sad, in a very kind of uncertain way. But you do kind of are, unlike a lot of what the book was leading up to and what the thesis of the story is, which is the idea of, these characters dwelling too much on the past and not being able to move on, and when they are moving on, they're contemplating an uncertain future. Pretty much like with the scene with Nayoko where she's talking to Watanabe, and he basically says, I have to go now, and then she gives that pause and that twitch coupled with her just continuing to talk and following on the same thought line that she originally started off with. That is kind of symbolic of how, when you're in that stage of grief, you're unable to move on. You're kind of stuck in this very kind of almost gloomy void of not really moving. You're like a stone statue, just sort of standing still. Your eyes are open, but you can't see anything. And that's it really is beautifully done. Yes, it's horrible and it's tragic to see this poor girl who's lost someone that she's loved and have to go through his grieving process with his best friend, who also has feelings for her as well. It really is a great and very powerful story. So she eventually gets taken to a special facility where she can be at one with nature. It's not like one of those clinical hospital places where you kind of are surrounded by patients and the cartoonish things. They're always kind of, very unhinged in a lot of movies and television shows, which is terrible. But what's really nice about the way the mental health facility is depicted in this book is it feels more like they're connecting the patients to nature, like it's surrounded by woodland, and it's more like little huts, but these very well designed, very kind of, eco-friendly huts, and they're surrounded by woodland and all these other things, so they can get at one with nature and they can feel sort of like this inner peace. So there is a sense of spiritualism with the book as well, and the sense that you don't need pills, you don't need, all these other things. Yes, pills are necessary if you have, a very severe case of something, like you're in danger of harming yourself or something like that. But what's very good is they use music, and they use our relationship with nature and the way we look at the world and how we look at the things going on around us to kind of shape how we're going to conduct the therapy. And that was just such a beautiful thing. Just the idea of taking that idea about being close to nature and pairing that with music, the way we feel that kind of spiritual attunement we have with music, that idea of, you know, we're indulging in sort of like a fantasy for a brief period of time, and then when it's over, it's done, and it kind of just shatters. That is kind of a very interesting pairing, and the book is just so beautifully captures that idea or that point of view. And this was done in Japan. This was set in Japan in the 1960s. So the fact that, you know, the Japanese were more, you know, in tune with spiritualism and kind of trying to, you know, open their hearts to other things really kind of goes to show that, you know, progress can come in the most bizarre of places. Like, a lot of people do complain that back then there was no progress, there was no degree of, you know, moving on or kind of going past social and societal difficulties or prejudices. And in many cases, a lot of people could argue that that's still the case. We're getting there very slowly. We're not even halfway done. We're just halfway as a society right now. But I think we can do it. I have faith that we can do it as a society. We can cure these terrible things. We can, you know, give peace and, you know, live harmoniously amongst each other without homophobia, without bigotry, without racism of any kind, without any kind of bigotry at all. And it's just a matter of, you know, keep on going, continue the fight where it's possible, but then just keep on going. And that's the point of what Norwegian Wood is that sometimes you've just got to keep on going, and you've got to try not to dwell on the past. And then there's this really heartbreaking scene where the person who's conducting the therapy, she's a nurse, I've forgotten her name, but she pretty much asks, she's playing her music, and she's saying, which song would you like me to play for you next and to sing? And Nyoko asks her to play Norwegian Wood, and it's beautifully sung, but I just kept on thinking to myself, she's going to cry, and lo and behold, she did. But that was her way of coping with the loss of her loved one. But this book is just fantastic. I'm not going to spoil the ending because it's a really good book and I recommend. I think everybody should give this book a go. It really is a fantastic read. It's well written. It's very well paced. It has great characters that are somewhat, you know, make a lot of questionable choices, but they're teenagers. They're going to do that. That's the nature of being a teenager, is you make mistakes. You screw up badly, but then it all depends on how you get back on the wagon and how you sort yourself out. So yeah, to me, I think just because he does these very questionable things does not mean he isn't capable of redemption. And I think that's something that's very important. But I think everyone should give this book a go, and I recommend everyone should at least read, you know, Haruki Murakami at least once, because he is a fantastic writer and he understands how people work. He writes in this very openly philosophical way, but he writes in this very simple style. But he always manages to have these very elegant and very poetic ways of describing things. But it doesn't feel like very heavy-handed literary writing. It doesn't feel like you need a GCSE in English literature to understand it, or a scholarship in English literature to understand it. You really do have... He really writes in a very grounded way, where it feels like, yes, it's very kind of eloquent and poetic, but it doesn't feel like you need a literature degree to get it. He couples simplicity with these very complex images very well and very beautifully. And I think that's something that a lot of English writers very rarely do, because they're always on one side or the other. They never try to find an in-between. And it's the same. And I think Haruki Murakami manages to strike that balance very well. And when I first encountered Haruki Murakami, I was at college, I was in my learning resource centre, I'd arrived early, and I was too early to go to classes. So I just decided to go into the library and read something. And I discovered a book called After Dark by Haruki Murakami. And the opening of this book pretty much opens up from the point of view of literally a bird's eye view, like literally a point of view of a bird as they're swooping through the cityscape. And it's such a beautiful opening passage. It really kind of left me stunned. It's kind of like when I read the opening of Jaws by Peter Benchley, and you have that opening done from the point of view of the shark, and you just see his, his very keen vision and his very almost predatorial way of looking at the water and the sea life. But it just feels like, it feels like us going down the street one day, or us, just going through the park or something like that. What's very kind of otherworldly to us is very kind of alien and almost very kind of science fiction to regular animals, and it's such a wonderful depiction of that and how things can get distorted by just a simple point of view. And I like the fact that in that book he pretty much writes it from the point of view of almost like when you're reading a script, where he would say, we are in a bedroom, instead of this character's in the bedroom and they're doing this. He says we. He addresses us, the readers, specifically. And he also goes ahead and he basically just also tries to say, we're watching this scene. A character comes into the bedroom and they're about to, get ready to go out or something like that. And he really does a good job of kind of using our input as an audience to try to really kind of give us a sense of point of view. And that's something that really is interesting in that book, After Dark. It deals with the idea of duality, that duality is simply a point of view. Good and evil is simply just a point of view. There's no real right or wrong about it. There is just simply a point of view, and that's all there is. And there's a lot of philosophical talk in that book, but yeah, there's that kind of theme is always brought up in that book. And it's the same with this, and it really kind of has this beautiful way of kind of taking these characters and exploring themes of love, themes of nostalgia, that idea, that kind of weird in between, where you're kind of between that nostalgic, delight and that inability to move on when you're grieving or when you've lost someone that you really care about and you don't really quite know what to do. So it's a very interesting book from that point of view, and of course it's just such a really wonderful story, and it's well written, and it's a great way of kind of taking a story and taking someone's memory of an event and kind of using it to tell this very kind of honest and very kind of on point depiction of grief and having to move on from tragedy, having to move on from the sadness of losing someone very important in your life. And it's just such a fantastic book. So I give Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami a 5 out of 5 stars. This is a fantastic, fantastic read, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And if anyone decides to pick up any one of these books, I would highly recommend picking up this one first, because it's a great gateway novel into Haruki Murakami's style and how he's able to really kind of play with these concepts and take these very real world ideas, or these very complicated ideas that sometimes are very difficult to put into words, and kind of express them in a very with a level of simplicity that very few authors would want to tackle. So I hope you're having a very good day, everyone. This has been Josh with Whimsical and Interesting Musings, bringing you whimsical and interesting musings every day all year round. Take care, bye-bye for now.